for your first question, I understand that you won many awards from a lot of societies and associations. How does it feel to be publishing work that's getting such great reception?
That was, no one has asked me that question before. I think it's a really great honor, first of all, to have these awards. Many of them are about American music or from American Music Society that studies American music, to consider this book as a book of the year, and that legitimized the field. And so I feel I got those awards not for myself actually, but for the particular history, and that's really made me very, very happy.
I understand that like the research on Cantonese media and Cantonese opera is very much still in its development stage. How does it feel to be like one of the pioneers in this industry?
It has actually had many scholars who study Cantonese opera in Hong Kong and also in South China. But for the America, I think it is true that has not done much studies except for really one or two authors here and there. And so to write about this history, I think the most important task for me is to really just make it something that people can relate. I think that's the most important task on my part. I do not want to write a history people look at it and think, oh, that's in the past or that's someone else's history. I want to write a book that people feel the character inside could be them, can relate. So I think the book really tried to relate to its reader at that level, and then from there, I open up the whole kind of details of the history or materials that have not been talked about, and so to do that is really a way to bring that history to the present in some ways, right? Because if it's just locked in a history, like in the safety box, then no one really need to see it. So make it relevant is important.
Yeah, totally. Like my family, we have like these photos that are locked away after a lot of family drama, and it's so unfortunate that it's locked away. So for you to like come in and basically intervene in that history that's being kept away from society is so important to understanding how Canadians operate in Canada and Asians operate in Canada. I want to focus on that relationship of relating to the content. How do you relate to Cantonese opera?
I think I relate to Cantonese opera in the sense that it is expression of the Chinese community, and to me, the fact that it talks about a lot of stories that I'm familiar with means a great deal to me. And to read those playbills that has this classic Chinese also means a great deal to me. I just have a passion for classic Chinese as well. And so I guess in a way, studying this is a gesturing to this Chinese root I have that's always inside of me, no matter what I study. And I'm really glad to find this particular area of study that can resonate with so many parts of me, and my training as a music scholar and my deep love for the Chinese literature and classics, and also my love for sound. So these kind of bring all of them together in a way that I feel very fortunate, to spend all this time with.
Yeah, totally. Growing up, were you exposed to a lot of Cantonese opera?
Not per se. I have my mother, as we talked about earlier, is from Chaozhou, and my my upbringing was in Taiwan, and there we listened to a lot of Peking opera, and so. And when I grow up, there's also Huang Mei Diao, which is another type of opera that was very popular. And so listened to a lot of different kinds of Cantonese opera. Oh, I forgot. There's also Taiwanese opera, right?
Oh, okay, cool.
And they're played, in TV all the time. And then we had a house helper, and she loves that. She adores quite a few of those lead performers. So I had these operas kind of just surrounding me. And even today, if you go walk around, the streets, you would sometimes, stop by a temple that has an opera because it has ritual function, right?
Right.
So they would put on opera to play for the deities. So in many ways, opera was around the living space, the urban culture. And so even though I didn't listen to Cantonese opera per se, the kind of percussion, the strings, and the kind of melodious kind of music was sort of all around me.
That's really cool, and that gives insight to like your background and how you
Right.
came to that conclusion of your book and all the media you've published.
Right.
Yeah. So you studied at Taiwan University, and then you went to University of Michigan to get your PhD.
Right.
Was there a lot of studies on how music is involved with society? I think for me, I've learned that like a lot of music is very sterile and doesn't consider the social factors. Did you find that same experience?
I mean, in terms of the study, the way people
Mhm.
study it is unrelated to the society. So
Mhm.
kind of, yeah, I think so. That's a very much separate. I study in a kind of conservatory environment, so perfect your instrument is really the thing to do, and perfecting the particular genre and songs and then skills were the goals for most of the students. But then, at some point, you start to ask, what is this all about, right? And you start to kind of pay attention to the larger environment in which music exists.
Right.
And then, yeah, and I think I also just really like to read. So I'm fascinated by history. And so, how music can relate to the kind of society as part of its history is fascinating to me because oftentimes musicians do know in their heart how important their music is to themselves and then to people around them. But it's sometimes hard for the society to remember how important music is. So,
Right.
so I think more of these kind of studies will allow the music to become more relevant to social studies. Yeah.
You said you love to read.
Yeah.
What were some of your inspirations for your book?
Wow. The inspiration for my book, it really comes from novels. And that's why in the talk I gave today, I emphasize about the two writers, Yesi and Impean. And it's important, I think, that the fiction writer creates atmosphere and space in which an event unfolds. And that is what I try to do with my history writing. So it's about recreating the sense of place and feeling. That's what fictioners are about, right? They make you feel that you're in that space, and then a good writer draw you into it like nothing else. So I think that's a huge inspiration for me. And another inspiration is actually a lot of culture study because they have really a very critical, laser sharp kind of analytical angles. That's very helpful in history writing, I think. And sometimes they focus on that, but they don't do so much of bringing into historical data. And that's where my intervention is also. Kind of bring that kind of cultural study perspective into the historical data and really trying to dig into the sonic possibility that's associated with those historical data.
very intelligent.
Sounds good anyhow.
Write that down. If you want to like learn about the environment, you should buy her book. So I'm wondering, who are you writing for? Are you writing for Asian Canadians? Are you writing for Hong Kongers? Are you writing for Guangdongers? Who are you writing for?
That's such a difficult question. I don't think you should have asked me that question.
Who would relate to it most then?
I think I'm writing it for myself in the sense that I'm a student of music, right? In very many genre. And I have this curiosity about concert music, but I'm also curious about the music culture as a way of expression. And I must add that I'm really a scholar of American music. So in the sense that trying to understand how the history of American music works. So I think I'm writing for that audience. And I think the reason I find it difficult to answer that question is because I think during the process of writing, I get pulled in different directions. And sometimes I feel like, oh, I need to add a chapter of this because I think Cantonese opera scholar want to see it. And sometimes I feel like I need to add this because, a historian would want to see this. So yeah, I do get confused about my audience sometimes. But I think at the end, the book take the shape it does because I think I realize, to tell the story that I'll be happy with. These are the things that I want to include. And so if this is not, detailed enough for a Cantonese opera scholar, then they might find inspiration in other books, not this one. So I did have one reviewer actually say just that, saying, well, Cantonese opera scholar would find chapter 5 to be, superficial, and then blah, 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 would find this chapter, blah, blah, blah. And I thought, that's fair, but they're in one book, and one cannot tell a story about this history without pulling all those in. So it's not necessarily the book's ambition to be exhaustive on any of this particular area, but they need to be brought in. And that is at the end to satisfy myself, I guess. Does that make sense?
That totally makes sense. Like today you were talking at her lecture that you wanted to basically acknowledge the past so we can think about the future and the present. Is that essentially what you're trying to say?
Yeah, basically. And I think acknowledging it is an important and yet difficult task, right? Because acknowledging not like just put it in a safety box and never touch it. It's have it affect your being. It's how you acknowledge it, right? And that's how we live our present and conceptualize the future. So I think as business major, how you conceptualize the future is very important to our society. So I'm so happy that you find this topic that engages you.
It totally engages me. Do you feel like your book has healing properties for the Asian Canadian community at large? Just because it goes through the truth and tells it for everyone to see.
Yeah, I hope so. And I do think that it, if anything, I think it validates, right? It validates a particular history and, like what you said, tells it as it is rather than have it, hidden or have it, like what I said today, imprisoned behind some kind of misconception, right? And I think that's very important. And also, recently the book was published in Chinese translation, right? And I find it's also very interesting the way some of the Chinese readers respond to it. And I think it's in a way, I can't really say important, but it is in a way meaningful for them to know this history. Because being in China, they have no, good understanding of how how the Chinese culture is,
operates outside of the border.
dispersed, throughout the world in this way. It is not to say that they necessarily need this knowledge to know who they are. It's more like understanding how to position themselves. I think it's important. So I think recently there's a journal in a popular journal in Guangzhou called Guangzhou Arts want to excerpt the whole first chapter, and the publisher happily agreed, and I'm really happy about that because I feel like it's for them want to excerpt the whole chapter. It means what I said means something to them. It's meaningful for people to know, so it's not irrelevant history.
Totally.
Yeah.
I'm curious to what the process of creating this book looked like. I know you traveled around the Pacific. You went to, Taiwan, you went to Vancouver, you went to Seattle, you went to Shanghai, Beijing, like everywhere. Did you find that there were certain cities that were like harder to research and others that were easier?
Yeah, it really is really funny because you would end up running into things that I just totally not expecting. I find that there's a lot of material in Hong Kong, and they are preserved really quite well, and so that's a really good place to do research. In Beijing, I was there 2 different times. The first time, I found the material was actually kind of, not preserved very well. And the second time I went, it was preserved so well that you can't have access to it because
Ancient Chinese secret.
They kind of locked away because they really treat it as a cultural treasure. So those recording, they just really don't want you to have it played. They treasure so much. So and at the time before it was opposite. So I think the archives in China are still kind of oscillating between these 2 positions. In America, I find the materials are so well kept in National Archive, and they're just wonderful trove. I mean, who would have thought, right? My colleague in doing Mexican theater say, well, Chinese exclusion allow you to have this material to study. I envy you. Can he say that? Can you believe that?
I don't know what to think of that right now.
Right. So it was odd, right? It's irony, historical irony. But I find in Canada, materials are digitized and they're kept well as well. And the only thing is that you really have to look.
Right.
You have to look very hard. And you stumble onto things that you can't imagine.
So I want to come back to that line from the Mexican. That was really interesting. From what I hear, he said that he wants a historical event to occur so he can write about something.
Actually, I think I probably just didn't quite represent him right.
Okay.
He's saying, well, Nancy, you have all this material from National Archive, but National Archive doesn't have anything for me to study for my book on Mexican theater. And of course, the irony is because Chinese was excluded, so every single person who entered the United States had to be documented and interviewed, and the theater had to pay bond and they write letters. So this huge amount of documentation to have surveillance on Chinese provided the historical material for me to study. And because Mexican never had to do that to enter the United States, so National Archive is less useful for this scholar.
All right.
And so that's the irony of it.
Clean it up for him. So we talked about relatability in the first part of this interview. When you reached out to the archives, right, did you find that there was a difficulty in making them relate to why your research was important?
I think in a way, it's not so much the archives that make it hard for this connection. What is hard is the effort to follow all sort of intuition I have. And that's something I'm going to talk about tomorrow in the archival studies, which is that you have an object, and this object allows you to ask another question. And these questions lead you to more questions. And those questions, has capability to lead you in all sorts of questions. So when I walk into an archive, they ask me what I want to study, and I would say Chinese theaters.
Right.
And I will list the things that I want to look at. And like what you said, they can relate. I mean, why are you doing this, right? So I remember once I was doing the study of U.S. Census, and I was plotting through all the census data and stuff like that in my local library.
How do you not get bored?
Well, you have to find ways to study it. And my librarian looked at me and said, "Well, Nancy, you're a music professor. Why are you looking at census? What did it do for you?"
I'm thinking that too.
So in a way, I think the intuition is very important, and you have to have faith in your intuition to follow through with different kind of directions, and then construct what they call. And these days, that's how people talk about archive too. Archive is what you construct. It's not the existing one for you to, dig. It's one that you construct. Is the archive. So
Totally.
the archive doesn't exist elsewhere. It exists with you and your questions.
My questions.
Anyone's questions. I think that's actually a pretty profound sentence.
We see the archives being put in your book. Is there one that we can show on the B-roll that you want to talk about?
I guess not really. There's so many different fragments, and so with each of the talks I give on this Cantonese opera Theatres America, I try to show fragments of what archive looks like. So today you saw the several different kinds of maps.
We saw the Trans-Pacific.
Right, but more importantly, you saw the map of Victoria, right, showing the theater and the jazz house. Right
across from each other.
Yeah, right across from each other. And you saw also the ways that the theaters are located in the Chinatown kind of area. So those are things people create to see, things in a really kind of interesting. Because without this, we can't imagine the whole scene as easily, right? Because if you just look at the pure documents, then it's a different story. Another thing that's really vivid to me was that I visited a mining town in Northern California, and in this kind of a small museum where they kept quite a few objects, from the Chinese that lived there, or the Chinese community that was there. I find a little drum, and underneath the drum, you turn it over, you see the maker. Right.
Cool. Okay.
I know, isn't it? I mean, just look at that maker, and you remember his name, and you go home, you trace to see what that was. But that little drum can be in that particular small museum forever, until you find it, until you flip it over and see it. It's an object, but it's there waiting for you. So I think, with our curiosity, we led to a variety of different places, and we turn a drum around all the time to piece together our stories.
Totally. Yeah. When you found the name and you went through the census, did you find anything interesting about this person? What was his name or her name?
Yeah, so name is really a difficult thing in the study of Chinese American history or Chinese Canadian history, because name doesn't necessarily trace you back to an actual person. The name just a name because they are Romanized,
Oh, okay.
right? So, for example, if I just record my name as Nancy Rao in the in the census,
Right.
20 years from now, people won't be able to necessarily tell who this Nancy Rao is. In that name,
But they have the Dr. Rao, so
they
they'll find them, right?
don't do that. But what I'm saying is that that's one huge difficulty in studying 19th century. The reason I can study the 20th century the way I did is because I study both from the English side and from the Chinese side. And from the Chinese side, we know who these people are. If I only encounter them in the National Archive with their English name, I won't have a sense of their importance. You see what I mean?
Right.
I only know, if I only have their Romanized version, I can't not necessarily trace back how they were in the Chinese society and therefore understand their accomplishment.
Mm-hmm.
So when I study those census, it doesn't actually help me trace names per se, but help me trace the occupation. So I can know how many were in this city at this time, in that time, and have a general sense of their distribution. And that's my purpose, at least at that particular inquiry. Yeah.
Well, thank you so much. We are out of time, but I really appreciated this interview and to learn why you made this book and what are the implications of this book.
Thank you. It's great talking to you.